If you want to destroy the Constitution and liberty, I've got great news. It's actually super easy, and it only takes 3 simple steps. So buckle up, because on this episode, I'm going to walk you through exactly how this method works. And by the end, I hope you'll see just how dangerously effective this 3-step method really is, so we can avoid these 3 steps at all costs. Now, of course, this is all completely hypothetical, so let's get right to it in just a moment. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, March 7th, 2025. Step 1, easy peasy stuff. Congress just needs to pass something that blatantly violates the Constitution. Pick a thing, pick a topic. We'll come up with one in just a moment. And from there, a president just needs to sign that blatantly unconstitutional act into law. Now, if you're like me, you're probably thinking your first thing is like, hey, wait a second, hold on here. Don't they take an oath? Don't they swear an oath to follow the Constitution? And yeah, sure, they do. But here's the trick. They don't care. They can just choose to ignore it, or they don't care at all as long as you keep putting them back in office. So the oath isn't going to stop it. So let's go to our hypothetical and come up with a more specific kind of example here. Let's say they decide to ban a certain type of a firearm. I'm going to use, for this example, let's go with a shotgun and say that if a shotgun has a barrel of less than 18 inches in length, then you can't own it unless you get a special permit from the federal government and you pay a really big fee. Basically, you got to get approval from them. And it doesn't matter that the Second Amendment has words like shall not be infringed. Those words don't do anything because, well, who's going to stop them when you get down to it? And now, mind you, the example doesn't have to be limited to a shotgun or the Second Amendment or the right to keep and bear arms. We could also talk about the First Amendment, because maybe they just pass a law that, for example, makes it a crime to publicly criticize certain government officials, because, as you know, too much free speech has got to be dangerous for somebody, right? Or maybe they decide to pass a law to create a massive national central bank, even though there's nothing in the Constitution delegated to the federal government authorizing them to create a central bank. But hey, instead of worrying about what's in the Constitution, they can say, well, this necessary and proper clause, necessary doesn't really even mean necessary. It just means convenient to whatever we want to get done. And so they keep pushing and they get something like that passed. But let's get back to our original hypothetical, this idea of restricting the ownership of a shotgun if a barrel length is below a certain length, 18 inches, because once that law gets passed by Congress, once the act gets passed by Congress and then signed as law by the president, that gets the ball rolling smoothly in our 3-step process or method to destroy the Constitution and individual liberty. It doesn't matter if it's blatantly unconstitutional, because now it's the law. At this point in the process, you might think someone would just file a lawsuit. So the federal courts could step in and stop things, can come in and protect us from the unconstitutional actions of Congress and the president. And this step 2, file a lawsuit in federal court, is where things really start falling apart for the Constitution and liberty in our hypothetical scenario. So thinking about that, this idea of banning without special permission and a tax payment to the government, some kind of payoff to the government of a shotgun with a barrel less than 18 inches, someone decides to violate that law and they get indicted under that federal law. And so then they go to federal court to try to overturn that federal law. They argue that, well, it says shall not be infringed, so how can this be okay under the Second Amendment? This is impossible, right? But the courts decide instead to uphold the unconstitutional law. They give it validity. And everyone goes along with the court opinion just because the courts say this is what the Constitution means. So far, here's what we have. Congress passes an unconstitutional act. A president signs the unconstitutional act into law. And then the courts, when it's brought before them, they give it validity. They uphold it and claim that it's legal and constitutional, which really brings us to step number 3. And all you have to do then to totally destroy the limits of the Constitution and individual liberty is really pretty much nothing. I mean, what more can you ask for? Just do almost nothing and wait on the government to fix the problem created by the government in the first place. Instead of taking responsibility, the people, instead of taking responsibility for protecting and defending their own constitution, for protecting and defending their own liberty, we, the people, instead trying to convince government to stop doing what the government was never supposed to be doing in the first place. They do this through elections, through lawsuits. They try to get new people in power. And rather than holding the line on the clear limits in the Constitution, the people put almost all their energy, their focus, their time, their money, and everything on getting new people in power with the hopes that maybe those new people in power will eventually, at some point in the future, get us new judges. And then maybe at some point in the future, years or decades in the future, those new sets of judges will decide that the previous judges made a mistake and, well, that thing that's been constitutional all along, well, sorry, we screwed up. That never was constitutional in the first place. But here's how it plays out in this scenario, because decades later, it's still on the books, and almost everyone considers it constitutional. They teach it in law schools. They talk about it in the media. The politicians uphold it and say that they have to expand on it. The courts never even question it. This is just part of the system. And after just a couple of generations, merely questioning that the original act was unconstitutional in the first place and never should have been followed or complied with gets you branded as radical or dangerous or an extremist, someone to be completely ignored. And just like that, liberty is lost. Now, does any of this sound familiar to you? Because really it should. And I hope it's obvious right from the outset here that none of this has been hypothetical at all. It actually happened. And this is a very short version of how it played out. But in 1934, Congress passed the National Firearms Act, and the president signed it into law. And in 1939, there was a case, United States versus Miller, where the Supreme Court upheld a federal tax and permit scheme on shotguns that had a barrel of less than 18 inches. And here we are, almost a century later, and this unconstitutional act is still on the books. This unconstitutional court precedent is still on the books, and they're all treated by most of the system as totally legitimate. And it's not, the worst part of it is not just that this stuff is still on the books, it's that it set the precedent for even more of the same in 1968, 1986, 1988, and beyond. And it set this precedent for more federal restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms, despite the clear language of shall not be infringed. And again, this could be applied to free speech in the First Amendment, to the Fourth Amendment, to establishing, for example, a central bank. It could be the same process can be used and applied to any part of the Constitution, to any right that you feel should not be touched by the federal government. Now, Thomas Jefferson specifically warned how this mentality would play out. He warned what it would lead to. Here he is in a letter to Abigail Adams. He said, "The opinion which gives to the judges the right to decide what laws are constitutional and what not only for themselves in their own sphere of action, but for the legislature and executive also in their spheres, would make the judiciary a despotic branch." So he warned that giving final interpretive supremacy of the Constitution to a branch of the government would make them a despotism. And he held the same view for many years and later called this type of a view giving us the despotism of an oligarchy. Lysander Spooner echoed Thomas Jefferson's view in 1850 when he wrote, "There is not a syllable in the Constitution that makes a decision of the judiciary of its own force and without regard to its correctness binding upon any body. An opinion is an opinion, and it's right only when it's right, not because it's an opinion." As Thomas Jefferson made painfully clear, and so many others at the time of the founding, it's the Constitution that's supreme, not the opinions about the Constitution by anyone in the government, and certainly not the mere discretion of the people who hold power. Here's how Jefferson put it. He said, "The government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion, and not the Constitution, the measure of its powers." And Spooner reiterated this essential principle, this essential point as well. Again, in 1850, he wrote that in the very nature of things, nothing but the law can be binding upon anyone. If a judicial decision be according to law, it is binding. If not, not. Simple, straightforward stuff. So when we're thinking about the Constitution as the supreme law, well, Spooner reiterates this as well. He said, "An unconstitutional judicial decision is no more binding than an unconstitutional legislative enactment. And a man has the same right to resist by force one as the other, and to be tried for such resistance by a jury who judge of the law for themselves." And I think it's this warning of judicial despotism, creating the despotism of an oligarchy, that led Jefferson to point out something that I think should be really painfully obvious to all of us. But unfortunately, to most people, it's not. Jefferson said, "Law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual." But I do think that's one of my favorite Jefferson quotes, if not my favorite. Depends on the day. I do think Spooner really said it best. He said, "The idea, so constantly asserted, that the permanent judiciary, the judges, have a right to decide all constitutional questions authoritatively for the people, is one of those gross impostures by which men have always been defrauded of their rights." So the next time someone tells you to basically just sit back and take it, no matter what the Congress passes, no matter what the president signs, no matter what the courts happen to say, just take it. Sit around and wait for the courts or the politicians who created the problems to remove the problems, or new people in the courts and the politicians to undo what the previous did. Maybe remind them that a real free people, does not wait for permission. Thomas Jefferson put it like this: "A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate." These are absolutely timeless lessons, timeless warnings that I think almost no one is taught about in the government-run and government-approved so-called education system. And that's why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about these absolutely crucial principles. And there is nothing, and I really mean that, there is nothing that helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat from that unconstitutional central bank, please consider throwing it our way. No one punches above their weight class better than the 10th Amendment Center, and we use every penny to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government likes it or not. They do not. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. It's all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And if you prefer to make a one-time gift or you're already a member, and I'm very grateful for that, but you do want to be able to pitch in more, I want to make sure you just have that option. No pressure. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, that's all spelled out. I'd really be very grateful for any consideration you can give to pitching in and putting your financial faith behind our work to date. Thank you for that. I hope you enjoyed this episode more than anything. It's a different kind of an episode than I normally do. And I should point out, I'm going to be off on Monday. My great buddy Robert Scott Bell is in town, so I'm going to spend the weekend with him and won't have time to prep, but I'll be back on Wednesday and Friday. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you chuckled a few times. I hope it was interesting, fun to watch or listen to. But more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something, because that's why we're doing what we're doing here. I'm so grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.